What's up, guys? Today I'm going to be doing a request of smartphones for around $150. So if you are on a tight budget, I do think these phones are super solid phones. So first up is the Moto G8 Power. It's right now 139 bucks, and that's a really good deal for this smartphone. It's one of my favorite phones from last year. You got a plastic body on here, and it doesn't feel super cheap because of the weight of the phone having such a massive battery. So it has a pretty nice looking design to me. It's got a water repellent coating as well, so that means it can survive like splashes or rain. You also have a pretty nice punch hole IPS display on here. It's a 6.4-inch display, 1080p, 399 for the PPI. Absolutely love the display on here, especially for an IPS display. I thought viewing angles were pretty solid, brightness was pretty good, color reproduction was pretty solid, and again, for 139 bucks, this is very good. So this phone actually got the Android 11 update as well, along with the Snapdragon 665 and Adreno 610. Basically, pretty much a stock version of Android, just with a little bit of Motorola customizations that they throw in there, like the flashlight chop and all that stuff. So I have a full videos on all these phones if you guys want to check them out. Also, this is not a gaming phone, but I had zero problems gaming on here. Call of Duty, PUBG ran fine on here, so you can do casual gaming. You do have micro SD support and 64 gigs of internal storage, along with 4 gigs of RAM on here. This phone actually has stereo speakers, which they took away from the G9 Power for some random reason. The speakers on this phone sound great, so I have no clue why they did that, but they sound really good on the G8 Power. That's why I really like them. So this phone unfortunately does not have NFC, so that is something to note, but you do have your headphone jack as well as a physical fingerprint scanner on the back, which is very fast. This phone actually has very good cameras as well, and if you look at my G8 comparison to the G9, I prefer the cameras on the G9. They just look better in terms of detail and color reproduction to me. And now you do have a quad camera setup, 16 megapixel standard, 8 megapixel telephoto, and 8 megapixel ultra wide, with a macro camera at 2 megapixels, 4K video, 16 megapixel selfie. As you can see from the photos themselves, at this price point, has zero complaints, pretty good detail, good dynamic range. The telephoto was fine, ultra wide was really good. The macro is fun to play with, but I wouldn't take it serious. But this phone has a massive battery at 5,000 milliamps, and that's really the highlight with this phone. You get all day battery life, and if you're a light user, you definitely could get around 2 days of battery life even. So battery life is really great on this device. Next is the Redmi 9. This phone hovers around 140 to 150 depending on sort of which model you get. But this is another awesome device from Xiaomi. I still think Xiaomi is making some of the best budget phones around that $200 or even under price point. I think they're better than Samsung phones because I get asked a lot of questions about that. But you do have a plastic body on here. I think the design looks pretty great. You have a two-tone design depending on which color you get. You have a really nice looking IPS display at 6.5 inches. It's 1080p, 395 for the PPI. Overall, had no issues. Water drop notch, good viewing angles, good color reproduction. No issues here. Android 10 with MIUI 11. With the Helio G80 and Mali G52 GPU. You also have micro SD support, 32 gigs of internal storage, and 3 gigs of RAM. So I found the phone to be able to handle MIUI just fine, even though it's a very heavy skin. Now some people don't like the MIUI skin. You can put a launcher on here. It does have like the little ads and apps that you did install, but overall it wasn't a huge deal for me. I found the experience to be fine. You do have micro SD support along with 32 gigs of internal storage and 3 gigs of RAM, and again that varies. That's just a base model. The more you go up, you get 64 and 4 gigs of RAM. So you do have a loudspeaker on here, which sounds fine. You have a 3.5mm jack, which sounds fine. NFC is actually on board along with an infrared port, so you can control a TV, air conditioner with this phone. It's very cool. The physical fingerprint scanner, again, very fast, works fine. I didn't have really any issues with this phone, and I think one of the highlights with this phone is definitely the cameras. You have a quad camera setup, 13 megapixel standard, 8 megapixel ultra wide, along with a 5 megapixel macro, 2 megapixel depth. Video only shoots in 1080p, and you have a 8 megapixel selfie camera, but I found the cameras to be really good. As you can see from the photos, really good detail. Dynamic range was pretty solid on here. The ultra wide was pretty good. The selfie camera also was pretty good as well. So I think for this price point, I don't really think you can complain. You're getting some really good cameras on this phone. So this phone again has another massive battery at 5020 milliamps with 18-watt fast charging. Again, this is a phone that can easily get you all day battery life, if not 2 days, if you're a light user. So no issues with this phone. It's pretty decently powerful, good cameras, and to me, really good looking hardware as well. Next is the LG G7 for around 150 bucks, refurbished, and this is a phone I highly recommend if you're looking for something with more bells and whistles and you want more of a flagship experience for cheap. This is an excellent phone to consider picking up. I have a lot of videos on this one. You have a premium design. Actually, it's a glass and metal phone. It's actually IP68 dust and water resistant as well, so you can get it wet. It won't break immediately. You do have an IPS display, HDR10 at 6.1 inches, so it's kind of a compact phone these days. 1440p display with 564 for the PPI. That's definitely one of the highlights with this phone. It's just a very beautiful high resolution display. Everything looks great. Watching videos on this phone, if you watch them in 1440p, you can really tell the difference. The IPS display colors look really good. You have a notch up top, which not a huge deal to me, but the display is super solid. It's a really high res, beautiful display. This phone has Android 10 on it, Snapdragon 845 and Adreno 630. I do not think this will get the Android 11 update. Again, I made a whole video about that, but this phone is still a really good gaming phone. It can play pretty much any game at high settings. So if you check out that gaming test, I have played Fortnite, Call of Duty, PUBG, all of those on this phone, and it did it no problem. So it's still a pretty solid performer when it comes to speed and gaming. Micro SD support is on board with 64 gigs of internal storage along with 4 gigs of RAM. You also have on here a 3.5mm jack with the quad DAC, so if you want high quality audio listening, then this is another really great phone. And also this phone has one of the best single firing speakers that I have personally ever heard. They just sound amazing. You also have NFC on board as well as a physical fingerprint scanner on the back. The cameras on the G7 are fine. It's a dual camera setup at 16 megapixels and a 16 megapixel ultra wide 4K video with a 8 megapixel selfie that shoots in 1080p. As you can see from the photos, perfectly acceptable at this price point. Detail is pretty solid on here. Dynamic range is pretty good. Selfies come out pretty solid on this phone. So it's a phone that if you put it in pretty good lighting conditions, it takes actually some pretty solid photos. There's also a Gcam port that you can get on here as well. So this phone also comes packed with a 3000 milliamp battery as well with 18-watt fast charging with wireless charging as well. So like I said, you have all the bells and whistles, NFC, everything on this phone. Now battery life, I guess, is the most subpar thing about this phone. You probably can get around 6 hours of screen on time, which is kind of a day. You can kind of get through the day with this phone, so it's not like the other phones on this list where it's just all day, 2 days. This is a phone you might have to charge by the end of the day depending on how you use it, but a super solid buy. Next is the Poco M3. This is a really good phone, and it has a unique feature that we'll get into, but it's got a plastic design on here. It's nothing too fancy. It's got an interesting design. It doesn't look like any of the other phones in its price range. It's got this crazy big camera module on the back, which I think it looks cool. I think it looks unique. Now you do have a 6.5 inch display. It's an IPS display, 1080p, 395 for the PPI. Again, a pretty nice display, pretty respectable bezels on this phone actually, wider drop notch. Had no issues with the display. Now this phone does run Android 10 with the MIUI 12 skin, Snapdragon 662 and the Adreno 610. Again, performance wise, this phone was pretty solid. Again, for casual gaming, Call of Duty, PUBG worked fine on this phone. You do have micro SD support 64 gigs of internal storage and 4 gigs of RAM on here. So this again was a pretty solid performer with MIUI. You actually have dual speakers on this phone, which are awesome at this price point. They sound really loud, are really great sounding speakers, along with the headphone jack. This phone unfortunately does not have NFC, but I believe there is an NFC model, so you have to get that model. So just pay attention to which model you get. Now you do have infrared port on here as well. And that is a really cool feature. I've always loved that. Again, you can control your TV or whatever with. Now the thing about this phone is it's got pretty good cameras as well, a 48 megapixel standard, 2 megapixel macro, and a 2 megapixel depth, but there's no ultra wide, which is kind of a letdown. I wish they would have just took away the depth, took away the macro, just give us an ultra wide here. I think that would have made the camera setup much better. And both cameras shooting 1080p front and back. As you can see from the photos, pretty solid looking photos, nothing too special. I wasn't super blown away with the image quality, but I think if you give it enough light, the cameras were pretty fine on here. Now the highlight with this phone is it got a massive 6,000 milliamp battery. This phone was impossible for me to kill even in 2 days. It's just amazing battery life. Very good battery life, especially if you're like a light user. You'll absolutely love this phone when it comes to battery life. Last on my list is the iPhone 7. So this is always a really great recommendation for anybody that wants an iPhone and you don't want to spend a ton of money. This one is like $137 right now. So this one has a premium design. It's aluminum frame, aluminum body on here. It feels really great in the hand. One of my favorite feeling iPhones. IP67 dust and water resistant as well. You have a very small 4.7 inch Retina display. So if you want something that's more compact, something that you can actually hold with one hand, this is a great option. 720p plus display, 326 for the PPI. Overall, just I find display color wise looks good. It looks pretty sharp. Had no issues with the display here. Now the cool thing about the iPhone 7 is that you actually have the latest version of iOS. So you have iOS 14.4, so it does support the widgets and all of that stuff, which is really cool. So you have the Apple A10 chip as well. So this phone was pretty decent with gaming, not super powerful, but if you check out the gaming test, it did really good with Call of Duty, PUBG. So you want like a little compact little gaming phone, this is pretty solid. Now there's no SD card support on iPhones, so you're stuck with the 32 gigs of storage, which could be a little low, so you might want to use cloud storage. You also have 2 gigs of RAM on this phone, but performance wise, this phone was still very snappy, again with that latest version of iOS. You actually have stereo speakers on this phone, sounded very loud, so no issues there. And you also have your Touch ID on here, which works fine. That was no issue, and the cameras on here were okay, not super impressive, and as time goes on, a little soft. That's all I could really say, but I think the cameras on here are fine. I do think the iPhone 7 still has really good video. You have a 12 megapixel standard, 7 megapixel selfie. As you can see from the photos, they're fine, just a little soft to me. And also the battery life on here is not super great. It's a 1960 milliamp battery, so you kind of have to pay that price for such a smaller phone. You get like 4 hours of screen on time, so this is a phone that you're definitely going to charge at the end of the day. But overall, this is a super solid buy. So what do you guys think? Be sure to let me know, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.